Name. Amen. Amen. Really want to think about the first three verses that are before us here in Esther chapter 5, as we see Queen Esther coming before the king, King Ahasuerus. We'll just read those verses again together. Esther 5 verses 1 through 3. Came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel, stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, she obtained favour in his sight. The king held out to Esther the golden sceptre that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the sceptre. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther? What is thy request? It shall be even given thee to the half of the kingdom. At the opening verses of this book, we find that we are taken into the rulership of the Persian king, King Ahasuerus, or sometimes known as King Xerxes in modern and secular history. Now, we know from our studies in Ezra on Sunday mornings, we've just finished them, we know that at this time the temple was already completed in Jerusalem. And we've also understood something of the fact that Persia, not Israel, not even Babylon, but Persia was really the superpower, the most important entity of the then known world. And in the opening few chapters of this book, we're really taken into the workings of the palace in Persia. King Ahasuerus, he has a bit of a fallout with Queen Vashti, and he then sets his eyes, in Esther chapter 2, he sets his eyes, and he could have set his eyes on anybody, but he sets his eyes on the young Jewish maiden Esther. And in Esther 2 verse 9 we read, The maiden pleased him, she obtained kindness of him, and he preferred her and her maids. He preferred her. He could have set his love upon anybody, but he preferred Esther. Of course, all under the providence and jurisdiction of God. So Esther then becomes the new queen. This young Jewish maiden, she becomes the new queen of Persia. Really, she becomes, through this one act of marrying King Ahasuerus, she becomes one of the most important people in the world. But in chapter 3, the plot begins to thicken. Because Haman, who we read of in this chapter as well, he suddenly takes a disdain to the Jews, to the Israelites, to God's people. Now at this stage, he doesn't know that Esther providentially is a Jew or a Jewess, but nonetheless, Haman, he takes a disdain to the Jews and even passes a decree that all of the Jews in the kingdom, they're going to be exterminated, they're going to be dealt with, they're going to be killed. And Mordecai, who of course is Esther's cousin in the Persian kingdom as well at this time, he hears of this, and he essentially comes wisely and in a sense, in a very common sense way, he tells her, look, use your influence for good. Use your position of prominence for good, for the good of God's people, for the good of God's kingdom. Use your position of influence and affluence for good. Go to the king and make your petition. Esther chapter 4 verse 8, we read, Go unto the king to make supplication to him and make request before him for her people. Go, Esther, go and make request. Make a petition to the king to have this decree reversed. Esther, of course, is worried. Now, why was she worried? She was, of course, the queen of Persia. She's in a sense, she's just going to have a conversation with her husband. What was the big deal? Well, there were two things that initially, when you read Esther 4, there were two reasons as to why Esther firstly refused to go before the king. There was a danger involved, a danger. You see, even though Esther was the queen, and Esther was the wife of Ahasuerus, her husband, who of course was the king, the danger was that no matter who you were, no matter your identity in the kingdom of Persia, you had to be specifically called or bidden to the palace to enter into the presence of the king. You couldn't just waltz in there and demand to see the king, demand to speak with the king, even though this was the queen. She couldn't do that. And if she did, moreover, the king had every right to kill her. Someone who would have done that, usually the sentence was very simply condemnation or death. So as I've said, there was a great danger here. If Esther just burst, as it were, into the doors into the inner court to the palace and simply demanded that she speak to her husband, the king, she could have been put to death. There was danger, but also was disinterest. Because this king had not really shown any interest in Esther lately. Of course, initially he had shown great interest in her, as we have seen in chapter 2. But in chapters 3 and 4, there's not much interest shown. It seems that perhaps the love has waned or whatever. But through the wise and inspiring counsel of Mordecai, Esther's cousin, Esther, she finally consents, in the words of Esther 4 at the end of the chapter, "If I perish, I perish. Even if I die, even if this costs me my life, I'm going to come before the king, make the petition, make the case, as it were. If I perish, I perish." She comes to this situation where the needs of her fellow countrymen and women, they are far more important than even her life or her well-being. If I perish, I perish. So I want you to see now in Esther chapter 5, in these opening few verses, here she is, and she is coming to the king. She currently is in a state of condemnation. If she waltzes into the palace, as I've said, the king has every right, that's the rule, he has every right to kill her. And yet she enters into the presence of the king. Why? To make petition. To make supplication on behalf of her people, who of course were in great danger. If this decree was passed and it was carried out to the full letter of the law, every single Jew, even herself and her cousin, they're going to die. They're going to die. Child of God, in this chapter, in these opening few verses, I believe you see a picture here, a lovely picture of the Christian, you tonight who are in Jesus Christ, coming before your King, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and simply presenting your petitions, presenting your requests to him. And what is our request that we make, as it were, to the King this evening? It's very simply on behalf of, to put it in the language we have used, to pray and to plead the need or the plight of our fellow countrymen and countrywomen. Let's face it, folks, there are people in this country that you know and they're perishing. There are perhaps even people that you have rubbed shoulders with this very day, and you know them, you love them, they're your acquaintance, whatever. But as things currently stand, they are under a decree of death that, of course, the king has every right to inaugurate and to initiate. There are those in there who are perishing. And here is Esther, and her spirit is that I am going to do whatever it takes. If I perish, I perish, to get to the king and to make my request to him. Oh, child of God, what resolution, what determination in the heart of Esther to come before the king and present the need of her perishing, her dying countrymen, the Jews, those who, of course, are God's people. In a spiritual sense, when you think about the needs of your family or whatever, who only knows, but the very petition that you make could be the very thing that brings them into God's family. That, of course, causes, as it were, God to come and to move and to alter the decree of death that they're currently under. Oh, tonight, as we come before God in prayer, we come before him and we make our petitions like Esther. I was thinking about that lovely hymn today, just as we were thinking about this portion. Thou art coming to a king, large petitions with thee bring. And here's Esther, and she is coming to her king. Of course, her husband, but her king. And she is bringing a very large petition indeed. So I want tonight, just for a few minutes, to think about Esther standing before the king. Esther standing before the king. The first thought I have here is her acceptance. Her acceptance. Look at verse 2. Read, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she obtained favour in his sight. The king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. In chapter 4 and verse 11, we read of the danger that Esther was in. Chapter 4, verse 11, we are told, "Whosoever shall come to the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the scepter, that he may live." So this here is the proof here. Here is the proof that if you came into the inner court, into the presence of the king, and you weren't bidden, the king hadn't specifically requested you, your presence, to come to him, to come before him, then you could be put to death. That's how it's put in verse 11 of chapter 4. There is one law to put him to death. If you barged in the front door of the palace, the inner court, and you weren't bidden, you could have been put to death instantly. And so here's Esther, and as I've said, she is in a position of condemnation. Yes, of course, this is his wife, and in a sense, of course, there's going to be some natural affinity there. There's a natural relationship there. There should be anyway. But in another sense, this is the law. This is the law. So Esther, as we find here in Esther chapter 5, verses 1 through 3, as she currently is, as we currently find her, she is in a state of condemnation, a state of death and danger. But, as we read here in verse 2, we read, Esther drew near, the end of verse 2, and touched the top of the scepter. If the king had his golden scepter, and he extended that scepter to the individual, that was the king's way of saying, look, you're accepted now. You're not under that law of death. You're not condemned. I'm not going to put you to death. No, you are accepted. And the individual who was coming into the presence of the king, they had to do something very simple. They had to take their hand and they had to touch the top of the scepter. So that shows that these two parties who were at variance with each other, Esther, as I've said, was in a state of condemnation, and the king, he could have been angry with her. However, now she is brought into a state of acceptance and reconciliation with the king. Here is the king. He is showing to her she is now welcome to address him. And child of God, this is your position this evening. Yes, outside of Jesus Christ, you were like Esther. You were like Esther. In your state of being outside of Jesus Christ, what were you? You were in danger. You were in a state of condemnation. And if you came before God on the day of your death, the death sentence, as it were, was going to be passed upon you. Eternal death. The second death. You would have been cast into the lake of fire. You would have been sentenced to hell forever. But in Jesus Christ this evening, in Jesus Christ, as we were singing that lovely hymn, and that's why we chose it, no more veil God bids me enter, by the new and living way. Because you now are in Jesus Christ, you are accepted before God. You have an audience with the King. And yes, whilst you are outside of Christ, you have no right to address God. Yet inside Jesus Christ this evening, you have every right. You can come boldly. You can come boldly. And this is what we see with Esther. As soon as she's in this position of acceptance and she places her hand on the scepter, she comes boldly, and she makes a very large petition to the king. Child of God, you need not fear tonight. At times we do harbour fears when we come to pray. And yes, at times our sin is ever before us, as David states in the Psalms. Yes, at times our sin is before you. Your sin is before you. But my friend, Jesus Christ has paid the debt in full for your sin. And so, whilst you may feel your sin experientially, yet legally you have every right to come before the King. Every right. Tonight, spiritually speaking, in this time of prayer, God, He extends to you the scepter. And when you think about Jesus Christ, my friend, who is Jesus Christ? He is described in the book of James as the lawgiver, as the one who really, in a sense, carries the scepter, the one who is the king, the one who is the King of Kings. So here is Jesus Christ, as it were, this evening, extending to the scepter, saying, look, come up hither. Come and bring your request. Come and simply pray. Ephesians chapter 3, verses 11 and 12, we have this very clearly spelled out for us. We read there, according to the eternal purpose which he purposed in Christ Jesus our Lord. Verse 12, in whom we have boldness and access, listen to it, with confidence by the faith of him. Boldness. Boldness. Why do you have boldness to come before the very God of heaven, the one who made you, the one who sustains you? Why do you have boldness tonight? This verse teaches you why. Because you have confidence by the faith of him. You're in Jesus Christ. And you have every right to access him. The term access here in the original text, the original Greek, it refers to an audience that you have specifically with a person of high rank. Now, if you've ever had the pleasure or at times displeasure of meeting someone of a high rank, you'll know that there's a procedure to follow. If you meet someone with a high rank, you normally just don't go up to them. Normally there's someone who comes, if you go into an office or whatever, someone comes and someone brings you to that person of high rank. Someone comes and someone introduces you to that person. And that's the thought here, the very specific thought in this verse. There is an officer who comes and he, as it were, he introduces you to that person of high rank. I believe in that. There's a wonderful picture of Jesus Christ, our mediator. What does Jesus Christ do? He takes you from the mess of sin. And what does he do? He introduces you to God the Father, in whom we have boldness and access with confidence. Before God, we are not rejected, we are received and accepted. You can come to God in prayer as Christ, your officer, has already paid the price for your sin and does the welcoming. You know, if you were to address the Queen today, it'd be similar. You never offer your hand to the Queen first. If she extends her hand to you to shake your hand, then and only then do you extend your hand to her. But we can't take the analogy too far, because you can't just speak to the Queen. You only speak when you're spoken to. So if she doesn't speak to you, you don't speak to her. But when we think about our King, in a sense, we can come to him at any time. Oh yes, there are times when he prompts us. But tonight we have access. And he hands, as it were, he extends his hand out to you and says, look, make your requests known to me. Her acceptance, look also at her approach. Look at verse 1. Read, it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house. Over against the king's house, the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house. The Hebrew word for stood here, it has an awful lot of meaning. It's not as if she's just standing there. It has the idea of standing for a prolonged period of time. Standing with persistence. Persisting, enduring, continuing. So it seems that Esther, as she entered into the inner court, and as she was confronted perhaps by the king, and remember, the king would have been on the throne, he would have been in an elevated position, he could look down on his subjects. As she comes and as she enters into the inner court, it's not as if she comes and then runs away again. No, she stands. She stands in the inner court. She's in her royal apparel. So, of course, in a sense, the king is going to notice her. This is, of course, his wife, his queen. She's in her royal apparel. But she does what she needs to do in order for the king to notice her. Remember, this isn't just going to be Esther and the king. There's going to be activity going on in the inner court of the palace. There's going to be servants. There's going to be things going on. And so Esther, she stands there. She persists, she doesn't give up, and she takes as long as it is necessary for the king to then notice her and then beckon her to come and extend to her his royal scepter. She waited until the answer was given to her request. She stood as long as was necessary. And child of God, just whilst you have immediate access into the very presence of God this evening, yet there are times when he is calling you to persist. calling you, as it were, to stand before him. Yes, whilst you have immediate access and you can come into his presence and you can then exit his presence, you have boldness, as I have said, you have confidence. Yet at the same time, when you're standing before God and you're praying for him for particular needs, for perhaps the needs of the perishing in terms of your loved ones, in terms of whoever it might be, at times, God, he calls you and he challenges you. He delays the answer. He delays, as it were, the response to your standing. He delays. Why? Often it's to draw you out in obedience and faith and trust in him. Oh yes, at times, yes, you should have every confidence in him. But you know experientially there are times when you lose your confidence. There are times where when an issue persists and continues for weeks, months, years, even decades, and you're praying about that same matter, and let's face it, in your experience, at time, your faith and your confidence, it waxes and it wanes. And so Esther is showing you that you need to stand. Stand in a spiritual sense. Stand before the king until he responds and he answers. Luke chapter 11 teaches us the parable of importunity, or not giving up, really. There's that man, it's late at night, he has a need, and what is he doing? In Luke 11, he is banging down, as it were, the door of his friend. He comes at midnight asking for 3 loaves. And at first the friend, it's midnight, he doesn't answer, and then eventually the friend does answer, and at first the friend, he says, "No, I am not going to give you the loaves." But if you read that parable carefully, you read in Luke 11 verse 8, "Though he will not rise and give him, yet because he is his friend, and because of his importunity, he will rise and give him as many as he needeth." Oh yes, this man was his friend, and he didn't even rise because he was his friend. But because of his importunity, because of the fact that he didn't give up, he didn't give in, he needed the bread, then he will rise and give him as many as he needeth. Because he didn't give up in knocking. A friend rose, a friend gave him bread. Yes, whilst there are times when we feel like ceasing in prayer, you must continue. Like Esther, stand before the Lord until the Lord grants your request. Yes, there are times the answer does come in quite an instant fashion. There are times when that happens. But often it's the case where it doesn't happen like that. You think of a stone cutter, for example, hammering away at a piece of stone. And what does he do for an awful long time? At times he can hammer and hammer at the stone with no results. No splitting of the stone. And then all of a sudden, he just keeps hammering. Then all of a sudden, the stone splits. Why does that stone split? Is it because of the might or the vehemency or the strength of that one particular blow? Possibly. Probably it's the fact that stone cutter has just continued to press upon the stone and chop and hit and hammer and whatever. And eventually, it's the many times that he has done it that weakens the stone, that does the damage. And in a spiritual sense, at times the Lord can be like that. Not that we weaken him or that we damage him. But often we as it were, we come before him, and he's just saying, look, keep coming. He's drawing you out in faith. He's drawing you up hither. He's drawing you to continue to reach, to continue, as it were, to plunder and to storm his kingdom. He's saying, look, just don't give up. And oh, child of God, it's my contention that there are times in your life, beloved, there are times in your life when God could answer if you just go once more. But we give up. We give up. And God withholds the answer. Her acceptance approach. Lastly, then, I want you to see her attentiveness. Look at verse 1 again. "It came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal apparel, stood in the inner court of the king's house." What's the significance of this being the 3rd day? 3rd day of what? In chapter 4, you discover that Mordecai and Esther and other Jews, they reserve to fast before Esther comes before the king. The third day here is in reference to the third day of fasting. Chapter 4, verse 16, you find this. So here is Esther. She has been fasting. This is the third day of her fast. And having completed that fast, and her spirit's now awakened, she is more sensitive, and she wastes no time and comes before the king. Matthew Henry stated on this thought, when the impressions of her devotions were fresh upon her spirit, she addressed the king. So she came in an awakened, in an enlivened state on the third day of waiting and fasting. And is it too wrong to assume praying? She came and she was ready. She was prepared spiritually. Spiritually she was alive. Spiritually she was awake. Spiritually she had prepared to come before the king. And child of God, whilst at times it is difficult, I know that. Yet there are times in your life when it's good to just prepare spiritually to pray. That's why I always maintain and contend that it's better to bring the needs of the day before God in the morning. Because you come before God and you bring the need, and you're, as it were, spiritually set up, and you are in tune then to look for the answer. But no matter what it is, what I would say is this practically, is seek to come before God in an awakened and alert and a spiritual sense. Now, what does that mean practically? For example, you may find it difficult to pray here this evening, and at times you think, what am I going to pray for tonight? And times there is that heaviness in prayer. You say, I can't take 3 days and fast like Esther. Here's a little tip for you. Take one truth that you have thought about today. Take something that was said in the message. Take something that has been impressed upon your heart in recent days. Think about it, meditate upon it, and bring that to God in prayer. Focus in on something. If you've read whatever you've read this morning, even in a more general sense, maybe not in terms of public prayer, but even in terms of maintaining that prayerful attitude throughout the day. The Proverbs clearly teaches us, be thou in the fear of the Lord all the day long. How does this happen? You take time, you take a verse, you take a thought, even this thought of access. Lord, I have access. I have every right to come before you this evening. That should encourage you. That should spiritually prompt you and awaken you and enliven you to pray. Yes, there are times when physically we can be fatigued. At times are like we can be like that. But spiritually, you can be enlivened. Because there are many times you read in the Bible of individuals coming and it's a late time, the hour is late and so on. But spiritually, they are alert. Physically, yes, they're weary. And I know that at times that's our experience as we come to God's house, whatever it is on the Sabbath day or even on a Tuesday evening. But I take something, take a thought, take a nugget and concentrate on that, meditate upon it, and bring that to the Lord in prayer. Martin Luther was having his hair cut and a shave. He was with his barber. His barber was a Christian. His barber said to him, obviously knew Luther, said to him, how on earth, or what's the best way to pray? Martin Luther said this, well, a good and attentive barber keeps his thoughts and his eyes on the razor and the hair. If he engages in too much conversation or lets his mind wander, he is likely to cut his customer's mouth, nose, or even his throat. The barber, he knows if he is to do it well, it requires his full attention, the full attention of all one's senses and members. And with prayer, it is the same. It demands concentration, attentiveness, and alertness. I'm sure the barber got the message. As he was shaving maybe the beard, of course he doesn't want to cut the throat of his customer. So he focuses. Child of God, at times it's hard to focus. What do you do then? There are things you can do, as I've said, to help yourself. And here was Esther. She didn't just glibly, my friend, come before the king. She was spiritually attentive. She had waited before God. There's an old proverb that says, he who thinks of many things thinks of nothing and does nothing right. How often is that your case at times in prayer? Sometimes there's nothing in the mind. Other times there's everything in the mind. And you think of many things and all of the needs of tomorrow and the duties of today. And you think of everything. And yet, if you're honest with yourself, times we can think of nothing. Nothing of any true value. Oh, here's Esther, and she's attentive. She's attentive. It's on the third day of a fast of waiting before God. And she comes and she spreads the need before the king. And what happened then? Well, verse 3 tells us how she then was given the answer. Then said the king to her, "What wilt thou, Queen Esther? What is thy request? It shall be even given thee to the half of the kingdom." Esther just wants to preserve the life of the Jews. And she's in a state of condemnation, possibly in a state of worry, apprehension. But whenever she comes before the king, as I've said, the king says, look, well, he gives her, as it were, look, you can have half of the kingdom if you just but ask. And how often the Lord's like that? Oh, we just have one small petition. Lord, help me in this tomorrow. Lord, get me through this next thing that I have to face. Lord, there's this problem, this difficulty. We just have this one petition. And here is God tonight, and he's saying, look, if you but ask for my kingdom to come, I'll give it to you. It is of the Father's goodwill. As he tells the disciples, "Fear not, little flock," it is the Father's goodwill to give them the kingdom. What should encourage you tonight to pray, child of God? God is in heaven, and he is waiting, as it were, to send his kingdom, to let his kingdom come. How does he accomplish that? Through prayer. Through prayer. You might have come here this evening with a heavy heart and with one simple petition or burden, a loved one, a friend, a need, whatever it might be, and yet here is God is saying, look, just ask half the kingdom, and it will be given. Esther standing before the king. Trust that these few thoughts will encourage you even as you pray.